In the far reaches of the galaxy where no one dared venture, the Solarvox Empire had spread its dominance like a shadow over countless star systems. Their fleet was the epitome of military might, each ship a fortress capable of obliterating any species that dared to resist their rule. They had conquered planets, crushed civilizations, and instilled fear across the stars. So when their sensors detected an anomaly drifting in the void, they paid little attention at first. After all, it was probably just another failed communications satellite or a derelict warship lost to time. But the signal persisted. It was faint at first, an odd pulse, not like anything they had encountered before. It was irregular yet deliberate, and most perplexing, it was not the random chatter of dead technology. It had a pattern, a strange code that seemed to call out from the cold abyss. The Solarvox had no use for mysteries. They preferred certainty and calculation, but this signal was like a puzzle calling for their attention. The fleet commander Krenos glanced at his tech officers and ordered them to investigate. For days, the fleet moved closer toward the source of the signal, still unable to fully decipher its origin. It did not match any known species communications. It was far too advanced, and yet at the same time it had an odd primitiveness to it, as if it was both ancient and futuristic. The alien vessels flanked Krenos' flagship. As they neared the source, the strange message grew louder and more coherent, but still indecipherable. The crew was tense, uncertain, but their commanders remained confident. After all, they were the greatest military force in the galaxy. The anomaly was a small blip on their star charts, insignificant, and yet as they approached, the signal ceased without warning. The silence that followed felt unnatural in its stillness. Krenos ordered a full sweep of the area. His fleet spread out in a formation designed to detect anything hidden in the dark reaches of space. His ships scanned the empty void, yet there was nothing but emptiness and quiet for several moments. Then a sudden flash of light broke the silence. A massive shape appeared seemingly out of nowhere. It was a ship, but not one that any of the Solarvox had ever seen before. It was unlike anything in their database. It did not match any known design from any known species. Its structure was strange, its contours angular, but smooth like a sleek beast built for war. The ship did not bear the markings of an ally or foe. It was alien, and yet it was here. Krenos stared at the vessel, his senses heightened. This was not a casual encounter. This ship was not just a relic or an abandoned artifact. This ship was moving, and it was coming toward them slowly, deliberately. It didn't even appear to have any weapons deployed. The Solarvox fleet surrounded the human battleship, ready to engage if necessary. But Krenos felt something unfamiliar gnawing at him. Uncertainty, a feeling he had never known before. They had never met a species capable of surviving their first encounter without being crushed, and yet this ship felt different. He ordered his fleet to halt and prepare for a response, yet the human ship continued its slow approach, as if it was waiting for something. The Solarvox had faced unimaginable challenges in their reign, but this was something entirely new. They had no idea who or what they were dealing with. The mystery of the ship and its strange signal remained unsolved. But one thing was clear: they would soon find out. As the Solarvox fleet surrounded the mysterious human battleship, a sense of tension settled like a thick fog over the command deck of Krenos' flagship. The crew moved in sharp efficiency, but their eyes betrayed the unease that simmered beneath the surface. The human ship continued to approach with unwavering resolve, as if it were oblivious to the presence of the powerful Solarvox forces assembled around it. Krenos watched the ship with a growing sense of discomfort. It seemed almost calm. Despite its unfamiliar design, the human vessel appeared massive, its hull reflecting the distant starlight, with a matte sheen that made it look more like a war machine than any civilian craft. Krenos' warships towered over it in size, yet the ship exuded an aura of danger that felt almost palpable. It was as if it had been built not to survive, but to dominate. The fleet commander motioned for his officers to continue their scans. They were still trying to make sense of the strange signal the ship had emitted, but now there was no longer any transmission coming from it. The silence was profound and unsettling. The human ship was not broadcasting any of its usual systems either. It was almost as if it was shutting out the galaxy, keeping itself hidden, yet still perfectly visible. Krenos' eyes narrowed. "Prepare to engage," Krenos commanded, his voice sharp despite the growing uncertainty around him. "Let's see how they respond." His fleet began to adjust its positions in readiness for a potential conflict. All their weapon systems came online, their shields powered up to full capacity, every weapon locked onto the human ship, poised for an immediate attack. But then something unexpected happened. The human ship spoke. It was not a traditional broadcast like the Solarvox communications. It wasn't a challenge or a demand. It was a strange series of bursts like encoded radio waves, flickering across the vast space between them. But somehow the message was being received loud and clear on every Solarvox ship. As they all struggled to decode it, the pattern seemed erratic at first, a jumbled mess of numbers and symbols. But as the Solarvox decrypted more, it became clear it wasn't an attack, it wasn't even a warning, it was something entirely different, a request for contact. Initiating translation protocols, Krenos muttered to himself, watching his officers scramble to interpret the bizarre message. It took only moments for the result to come through, though it was nothing like the Solarvox had expected. "We come in peace," was the simple message that blared across the fleet's screens. The words were not just strange but absurd to Krenos. They made no sense. This was no ordinary encounter. This was a challenge, an unprovoked force from the unknown. The last thing they would expect to hear was peace. But there it was. This species had the audacity to claim peace when every fiber of Krenos being screamed that it was a trap. "Peace," one of his officers echoed incredulously. "How can they expect us to believe that?" Krenos clenched his fists. The suggestion was absurd, but in the back of his mind the alien commander couldn't shake the feeling that this was not a simple matter of overwhelming force. No, the human ship was unyielding in its calm and its challenge. It had not fired a single shot, nor even shown any sign of aggression. Yet it did not retreat either. The possibility lingered in Krenos' mind. Could this be a trick? Could it be something even more dangerous than what his fleet had faced before? "Do not lower your guard," Krenos ordered as he stared down at the human ship, his mind racing. He knew this was far from over. The stillness of space between the two fleets hung heavy, a quiet before the storm that could feel as dangerous as any weapon. Krenos stood motionless in the center of the command deck, his piercing gaze locked onto this strange human ship. It had not moved, not yet shown any sign of weakness or fear. There was only that chilling message, "We come in peace." It grated against his instincts like a blasphemous lie, one that his mind could not accept. Krenos knew that the Solarvox had never been one to hesitate. The galaxy had seen what they were capable of, their firepower, their fleets, their overwhelming dominance. For centuries, they had wiped out civilizations with ruthless efficiency, expanding their empire to every corner of the known universe. They had never been stopped. Why should this human ship be any different? But the longer Krenos studied it, the more certain he became of one thing. The humans were a threat, whether they knew it or not. "Prepare weapons for full engagement," Krenos ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "We will show them what happens when they dare approach us without understanding their place." His crew scrambled to obey, turning dials and pulling levers as the massive guns and shields of the fleet hummed to life. The Solarvox fleet, vast and overwhelming, positioned itself around the human ship, now within striking distance, every sensor locked onto the vessel, every weapon system primed. Krenos could feel the collective breath of his fleet held in anticipation, the thought of showing these strangers what true power was. They would crush them, annihilate them, and the galaxy would know the Solarvox were untouchable. Again. Without a word, the signal was given. The first salvo of energy blasts tore through space, a streak of raw destruction, heading straight for the human ship. Krenos watched eagerly as the bolts of searing plasma hurtled toward their target. There was no way a ship that primitive could withstand such an assault. Nothing could. But as the beams closed in, something astonishing happened. The human battleship's shields flared with an almost eerie brilliance, an energy field of such intensity that it absorbed the plasma bolts as if they were nothing more than raindrops striking a wall. The Solarvox watched in stunned silence as the deadly energy dissipated harmlessly against the shield, with no effect. The human ship had done the impossible. It had deflected the assault without so much as a scratch. Krenos' eyes widened in disbelief. No race, not even the most advanced civilizations the Solarvox had encountered, had ever possessed shields so strong, so resilient. This ship, this human ship, wasn't just tough, it was otherworldly. A sudden pang of realization struck Krenos. These humans had something he had never seen before, something unknown and dangerous. Increase firepower, Krenos commanded, his voice growing sharper. He knew they couldn't stop now. They had to break through, had to destroy this threat. The Solarvox fired again, this time with all their might. Weapons charged and released, more powerful than before, aimed at the heart of the human ship. If the first barrage had been ineffective, this would surely finish the job. But once again, the human ship's shields flared to life, absorbing the impact with almost mechanical precision. It wasn't just the shield's strength, it was the way the ship moved, as if it were anticipating the strikes. It adjusted and adapted, as though it were constantly calculating the best defense against every attack the Solarvox launched. Krenos' fists clenched at his sides, frustration beginning to boil within him. This wasn't supposed to happen. This shouldn't be possible. And then, as if to prove just how out of their depth the Solarvox were, the human battleship responded. In a split second, the human ship released a barrage of its own, a series of white-hot, high-frequency energy blasts, each one more concentrated and precise than anything the Solarvox had ever seen. They struck with the ferocity of a supernova, cutting through space and slamming into the Solarvox flagship. The first shot tore through the outer hull of the ship, the force shaking the entire fleet. Another blast followed, slamming into a nearby warship and sending it spiraling out of control. "Shields down," one of Krenos' officers yelled as panic began to spread across the command deck. The human ship was striking back with a level of precision and force that was beyond comprehension. The Solarvox fleet, once brimming with the confidence of a force that had never been challenged, was now reeling, unable to respond effectively. Every strike was like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through their defenses. Krenos stood frozen, his mind racing. The human ship wasn't just surviving. It was pushing back, forcing his fleet into a retreat they hadn't even begun to consider. This was no mere anomaly. This was a battle, and the Solarvox had underestimated their opponent. "Retreat," Krenos finally shouted, his voice filled with fury and disbelief. "Fall back. Regroup. We need a new plan." But it was already too late. The human battleship was not giving them a chance to recover. The first battle was lost, and the Solarvox were left scrambling for answers. The battle had been short, brutal, and nothing like the Solarvox had expected. The once proud fleet now lay battered and disorganized, with several ships incapacitated or floating in pieces. Krenos stood at the command console, his gaze fixed on the display of the human battleship. It was unscathed, its hull gleaming despite the ferocity of the assault it had withstood. For the first time in his life, Krenos felt a cold, gnawing unease deep within him. The human ship was not just resilient. It was a masterpiece of warfare, and the Solarvox were no longer in control. The crew of the flagship worked furiously to stabilize the damaged systems, but the shockwaves from the human ship's retaliatory blasts still reverberated through their vessels. It had been a brutal wake-up call, and the Solarvox were left to pick up the pieces of their pride. Their weapons, their technology, their advanced strategies, nothing had prepared them for this. "Report," Krenos barked, his voice low and dangerous. "Fleet status. 60% damage. 4 ships lost," one of his officers replied, the tension in their voice palpable. "We've sustained critical damage to the outer shields, and several engines are offline." "The human ship, it's still operational, Commander." Krenos clenched his fists. He couldn't believe it. The human ship had not only absorbed their attack, it had endured and struck back with a precision that left them reeling. How could this be? No known species could withstand such an assault and counterattack with such ferocity. "Scan their vessel again," Kranos ordered, a grim determination settling over him. "I want to know everything about that ship. Its capabilities, its technology. How is it able to deflect our weapons so easily?" The scanning team worked in a flurry, pulling up every possible reading. The human battleship was an enigma. Its hull material defied classification. It wasn't made of anything the Solarvox had seen before. The metals, alloys, everything seemed to be something new, something beyond anything in their arsenal. The human ship didn't just absorb energy. It seemed to manipulate it, rechanneling incoming attacks in ways that baffled the Solarvox tech. Whatever technology was powering it was beyond their understanding. "Commander, there's something else," one of the officers said, hesitating for a moment. "Their propulsion system, it's unconventional. It's not based on our standard systems, no fusion engines or warp drives. It's like they're bending the laws of physics to move through space." "Impossible," Kranos growled. "We've been the dominant force for eons. There is no technology beyond us." But deep down, he knew they were facing something entirely different. This human ship was not just a technological marvel. It was a weapon unlike any other. It didn't just fight. It adapted, it overcame, and it made the Solarvox's greatest strength seem insignificant. As Kranos digested the data, his mind raced. How could they fight something that didn't play by the same rules? The human ship wasn't just surviving, it was evolving in the midst of combat. Every move, every strike, seemed calculated to exploit weaknesses the Solarvox had never considered. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a lesson. And the Solarvox were failing. The human ship, still floating in space, didn't seem to be in any hurry. It was waiting. It had shown them its power, but it hadn't struck again. The silence was deafening. Kranos knew this wasn't a moment of mercy. It was a silent challenge. The humans were waiting for the Solarvox to make their next move, to see if they would learn or repeat their mistakes. "Commander," one of his officers said, his voice now trembling. "They're broadcasting again." Kranos' eyes narrowed. "What is it this time?" This time, the message was different. It wasn't a simple plea for peace, nor was it an aggressive taunt. It was a series of data streams, complex and filled with information. The humans were offering knowledge, offering to share their technology. But there was an underlying tone to the transmission. It wasn't just a gift, it was a challenge. They were telling the Solarvox, in no uncertain terms, that the old ways of thinking, of domination and force, were no longer the path forward. "Why would they offer us this?" Kranos muttered under his breath, his pride still bruised from the battle. "They think they can teach us. Do they not know who we are?" The transmission ended, but the question lingered. The human ship had done the unthinkable. It had survived the unrelenting assault of the Solarvox fleet, and now it was offering them something in return, something they had never considered. An opportunity to learn. But Kranos was no fool. He had seen the arrogance of the human message, the audacity to think they could change the Solarvox, to turn the tables, and make them question everything they had believed in. It was a new kind of battle, one that didn't rely solely on weapons, but on something far more dangerous, ideas. The Solarvox were no longer in control of the battlefield. And Kranos, for the first time in his life, wasn't sure what to do next. The Solarvox fleet had retreated to regroup, but the bitter sting of defeat lingered in the air. Kranos paced back and forth in the war room, his mind whirling with the remnants of the failed assault. Every instinct told him that the human ship was something entirely new, something that defied all the rules they had relied on for centuries. How could a race so young, so insignificant in their eyes, have such a weapon at their disposal? It made no sense. His officers worked tirelessly, rerouting power to their failing ships, trying to salvage what little they could. But no amount of repairs could erase the deep humiliation they had suffered. The human ship had not only withstood their assault, but had inflicted severe damage on their fleet in return. It was as if the laws of warfare had been rewritten in real time, and the Solarvox were on the losing side. "Report," Krenos said, his voice sharp, though the frustration was evident. "Commander, our fleet has been heavily damaged," one of his officers replied. "But we've begun repairs. The human ship, it's still out there, waiting." Krenos stood still, his thoughts a chaotic mess of anger and confusion. He had been the unquestioned leader of a fleet that had swept through the galaxy with unmatched power. And now, a single human battleship had shown them how utterly unprepared they were. But Krenos wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. "Send another wave," Krenos ordered. "We won't allow this insult to stand. It's time we show them the might of the Solarvox in full." The fleet had been battered, but not broken. The Solarvox prepared for round two, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. They would adjust their tactics, make their next move more unpredictable, more overwhelming. The human ship had proven it could absorb their firepower, but Krenos would not make the same mistake again. This time, they would overwhelm it with sheer force. The ships were readied, the battle protocols revamped. They would strike from multiple angles, in rapid succession, making it impossible for the human ship to predict their moves. Krenos had learned one thing in this encounter: the human vessel might be able to absorb a direct attack, but it couldn't possibly fend off every strike coming from every direction. It was time to outnumber them. As the fleet powered up and moved into position, Krenos issued the command: "Fire." But this time, something unexpected happened. The human ship didn't sit idly by, waiting to be overwhelmed. Instead, it responded immediately, like a living creature sensing danger. The ship seemed to come alive, its weapons systems lighting up with an almost unnatural speed. Before the Solarvox had a chance to fully coordinate their attack, the human ship's guns fired back with terrifying accuracy. The Solarvox had expected a counterattack, of course, but the sheer speed and precision of the human ship's strikes caught them completely off guard. Within moments, the lead Solarvox ship was hit with a volley of energy blasts so intense that its shields were obliterated in a flash. The ship was then struck directly, tearing through its hull with a force that sent it spiraling off course, a burning wreck drifting into the cold void of space. "How is this possible?" one of Krenos' officers gasped, watching the destruction unfold. "The ship, it's responding too quickly, faster than we can react." Krenos clenched his teeth, his mind racing. The human ship was doing the impossible again. It was anticipating their moves before they even made them, adjusting its strategy on the fly with a precision that was beyond anything the Solarvox had ever encountered. This wasn't just raw power, it was intelligent, adaptive warfare, a kind of battle-hardened intuition that the Solarvox had never seen in any species before. "Reconfigure our weapons," Krenos snapped, his mind shifting gears. "We need to fight smarter, not harder." But no matter how much the Solarvox adapted, the human ship seemed always one step ahead. Every move the Solarvox made was countered almost before they even knew it was coming. And as the battle raged on, Krenos began to realize that this wasn't a battle of weapons. It was a battle of minds. The human ship was not just surviving. It was outthinking them, exploiting every weakness in their strategy, every flaw in their assumptions. The Solarvox had built their empire on the principle of overwhelming force and technological superiority. But here, against a foe they had dismissed as primitive, those very strengths had become their weaknesses. The human ship didn't rely on sheer power. It relied on its ability to adapt, to predict, to move with a kind of precision that the Solarvox could never replicate. Krenos watched as another Solarvox warship exploded in a brilliant flash, the result of yet another devastating hit from the human vessel. His heart pounded in his chest. This was no longer a conventional battle. This was a war of wits, a challenge of intellect, and for the first time in his life, Krenos wasn't sure if his fleet could win. Krenos stood at the center of the war room, His fists clenched tightly as his gaze remained fixed on the holo display in front of him. The human ship, though smaller in size compared to the vast might of the Slarvox fleet, had proven itself time and time again to be far more than just a vessel. It was a weapon, an extension of an intelligence that was constantly evolving, constantly adapting to every new move the Slarvox made. The battle had escalated beyond their initial expectations. The Slarvox fleet was now down to half of its original strength, and every attempt to overwhelm the human vessel had been met with failure. The human ship moved with an uncanny precision, countering the Slarvox every strike, and when the Slarvox ships tried to regroup, the human ship tore into their weakened lines without mercy. It was as if the humans could predict their every move before it even happened. "We need a new plan, Commander," one of Krenos' officers said, his voice shaking. "Their tactics are too fluid. We're being outsmarted at every turn. We can't match them head-on." The words stung Krenos like an open wound, but he knew his officer was right. For the first time in their history, the Slarvox were not simply facing an enemy. They were facing a mind that fought back, a mind that saw the battlefield as a puzzle, one that could be solved not through force alone, but through strategy, ingenuity, and intelligence. Krenos' eyes narrowed. The humans had done something no other species had managed. They had turned the Slarvox's greatest strength, overwhelming firepower, against them. They had learned to see past the walls of shields and weapons, to understand that there was more to combat than just brute strength. The human ship's attacks weren't just random strikes. They were carefully calculated, designed to exploit the Slarvox's weaknesses at every possible turn. Krenos had underestimated them. "We will need to think beyond firepower," Krenos said, his voice low but resolute. "We have to strike at the heart of their tactics, disrupt their coordination. If they can anticipate our movements, then we must confuse them. Deception, unpredictability. These will be our weapons." His officers looked at each other, unsure of the path forward. They had been bred for one purpose: to conquer and destroy. Their fleets, their weapons, their technology, they were all built with the idea that raw power and overwhelming force would win any battle. But this human ship, this new foe, was challenging that idea. They had no playbook for outwitting an enemy, for thinking their way through a battle. "We'll need to coordinate a multi-pronged attack," Krenos continued. "If we can confuse them, break their focus, we may gain the upper hand. But we must act quickly. They are already beginning to read our movements. We cannot afford another failure." The officers nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. But the plan was risky. No Slarvox had ever fought in such a way before. It wasn't about sheer destruction anymore. It was about outthinking the enemy, about throwing them off balance and taking control of the battlefield in ways the humans hadn't anticipated. Krenos' thoughts turned back to the human ship. It was still out there, hovering just beyond their reach, waiting for the next move. There was something almost deliberate about it, as though it was toying with them. The Slarvox might be the most advanced empire in the galaxy, but against a foe like this, they were starting to feel outclassed. "We'll use their confidence against them," Krenos said, his eyes narrowing in thought. "The human ship believes it's in control, but they're overlooking one thing. There's no such thing as a perfect strategy. We'll make them believe they're winning. Then we'll strike when they least expect it." The strategy was set. The Slarvox fleet would split into multiple groups, each moving in unpredictable patterns. They would feint, retreat, and then come back together at the last possible moment. The idea was simple: confuse the human ship into thinking they were broken, only to spring a coordinated assault at the precise moment when the humans would be most vulnerable. The officers got to work, relaying the orders to the fleet. As the Slarvox ships moved into position, the air on the flagship's command deck grew tense. The strategy was risky, but there was no other option left. They couldn't outfight the human ship directly, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could outsmart it. Meanwhile, on the human ship, the crew was silent. They had watched the Solarvox regroup and prepare their new strategy. There was no doubt in their minds that this new phase of the battle would be more dangerous than ever. But the human crew, too, had been adapting. They had learned to read the subtle movements of the Solarvox ships, to anticipate their next move. They had become the hunters, and now the Solarvox were the prey. The next phase of the war was about to begin, and both sides were preparing to play the game on a level neither had anticipated. One side would need to win with force, the other with wit. It was a battle of intellect, and only one could come out victorious. Krenos paced nervously within the confines of his war room, the tension growing by the second. The Solarvox fleet had reassembled, and now they were ready for the next phase of the battle. Their plan was set into motion. Deceptive maneuvers designed to lure the human ship into a trap, to mislead it into thinking the Solarvox were retreating. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was their only shot at taking back control of the fight. The fleet began to move. Some ships veered off, pulling back from the human battleship's direct line of sight, creating the illusion of retreat. Others split into smaller groups, scattering in different directions across the battlefield. The idea was simple: confuse, distract, and scatter the human ship's focus. Krenos was banking on the hope that the human vessel, so used to fighting with precision and intelligence, would take the bait. "Engage the plan," Krenos commanded. His voice was firm, but underneath the surface, he could feel the cold edge of uncertainty. Could they truly outsmart the human ship? Could the deception work? Across the fleet, the first wave of false retreats began. The Solarvox ships appeared to withdraw, leaving gaps in their formations and presenting opportunities for the human ship to strike. As expected, the human vessel took the bait. A small flurry of energy blasts fired from the human ship, targeting the nearest retreating Solarvox ship, but it was a miscalculation. The ship had not truly retreated. It had instead gone into a prearranged position. The moment the human blast missed, the Solarvox warship fired back with a volley of missiles, striking the human ship's shields. Krenos felt a surge of victory pulse through him. It had worked. This first strike had succeeded in luring the human vessel into attacking too early, its strategy thrown off by the feigned retreat. But that was just the beginning. The trap was in motion now. As more ships scattered, Krenos could sense the growing uncertainty among the humans. They had been lured into the false impression of victory, but the Solarvox fleet was now closing in from all directions. This was where the real attack would happen, where they would finally overwhelm the humans with an onslaught they couldn't hope to defend against. But the Solarvox underestimated one thing: the human ship's ability to adapt. Krenos' thoughts raced. The trap had been set, and it seemed perfect. But this enemy wasn't like anything they had ever faced before. Without warning, the human battleship stopped firing, instead retreating from the scattered Solarvox ships. It wasn't abandoning the fight, it was repositioning itself. Krenos' eyes narrowed. The human ship was calculating again, repositioning itself to cut off the Solarvox fleet's ability to regroup. The ship was not responding with brute force, it was using precision, anticipating where the Solarvox ships would converge. "Impossible," Krenos muttered to himself. "They're adapting too quickly." The human ship, now in the perfect position to intercept, fired a devastating series of precise energy blasts directly at the Solarvox warships that had previously spread out. The blasts were so accurate and devastating that they took out two of Krenos' ships within seconds, forcing the Solarvox to scatter once again, their plans now completely disrupted. The human vessel was no longer reacting, it was countering, outthinking them at every turn. The Solarvox fleet had been outmaneuvered once again. Their own deception had been used against them. Krenos clenched his fists, seething in frustration. The humans had read the feint and exploited the weakness, exploiting their own plan. "This is no longer a battle," one of Krenos' officers said, his voice low. "It's a slaughter." Krenos felt the weight of the statement. The Solarvox had prided themselves on being masters of war, undefeated and unparalleled. But here, in the heart of this conflict, they were facing an opponent who didn't simply rely on force. The human ship was thinking several steps ahead, outmaneuvering them with strategies they couldn't comprehend. Krenos watched the human ship from the viewing screen. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a force of nature, a living embodiment of everything the Solarvox had taken for granted. The human vessel had shown them how fragile their confidence had been. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. "We can't keep up with them," Krenos said, his voice strained with the weight of defeat. "They've learned our tactics, and they're faster than we can react." As he watched the Solarvox ships break apart, one after another, he knew the truth. The humans had not just come in peace, they had come to challenge the very nature of power. And the Solarvox were now facing the bitter realization that they had underestimated a species that had only just begun to show its true strength. The battle was far from over. But in this moment, it was clear. The Solarvox were not the only players on this stage anymore. The humans had proven that intelligence and strategy could rival even the mightiest force in the galaxy. And now, the universe would never be the same. The remnants of the Solarvox fleet drifted in space, fragmented and broken, while the human ship loomed above them like a predator surveying its fallen prey. Krenos watched helplessly as his ships burned, their once proud forms reduced to nothing more than floating debris. He had never imagined such a scenario, a universe where the Solarvox, the undisputed masters of war, could be so thoroughly outclassed by a species that had barely made its mark on the galaxy. The human ship, still intact and seemingly unscathed, hovered in place. It wasn't celebrating. It wasn't gloating. Instead, it was waiting, watching, calculating, as if it were studying the Solarvox fleet, analyzing their every move and reaction. Krenos could feel the weight of those silent eyes on him, though he knew the human ship had no intentions of finishing the Solarvox off. No, it was making a statement. Aboard the human ship, Captain Lyra stood at the helm, her fingers hovering over the controls as she monitored the damage reports from the battle. Despite the ferocity of the engagement, her ship had emerged victorious, its shields still operational, its crew unscathed. They had expected a hard fight, but they had not expected the Solarvox to be so unprepared for the intricacies of strategy, to be so easily blindsided by tactics that didn't rely solely on overwhelming power. "Captain," her communications officer said, "the Solarvox are asking for a ceasefire." Lyra didn't respond immediately. She watched as the remnants of the once mighty fleet shifted into a defensive formation, their movements slow and deliberate. It was clear the Solarvox had no interest in continuing the fight, not because they had lost. They had been defeated, and the reality of that loss weighed heavily on them. "Put them through," Lyra replied. The image of Krenos flickered to life on the screen, his face grim, a deep sense of frustration in his eyes. His fleet was broken, his forces devastated. He was no longer the powerful conqueror. He was a defeated leader, forced to humble himself before the humans. "I request a ceasefire," Krenos began, his voice heavy with disbelief. "We cannot continue this war. We underestimated you. Our entire empire underestimated humanity." Lyra regarded him with a quiet intensity. "Underestimated? You thought you could crush us because we were small, because we didn't have your weapons or your ships." Krenos looked away for a moment, clearly struggling with the weight of his defeat. "Yes, we believed that our strength alone could overwhelm you. But we were wrong." Lyra nodded slowly. "Strength is not just about firepower. It's about the ability to adapt, to learn, to outthink your opponent. You relied on the same tactics, the same methods that have worked for centuries. But that doesn't work when you're up against something new." Krenos clenched his jaw, but didn't argue. He knew she was right. The humans had proven something more than just their technological superiority. They had proven that intellect, strategy, and adaptability were just as potent as any weapon. A long silence passed between them. For Krenos, the loss was more than just a military defeat. It was a humiliation that could never be undone. For the first time in his life, he felt the heavy burden of failure. It was a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. "We will retreat," Krenos said, his voice low, almost hollow. "But we will not forget this. Humanity has shown us that the future is not about power, it is about understanding. You have won this battle, Captain Lyra. But know this, we will return. And when we do, we will not be the same." Lyra leaned forward slightly. "Then I hope you're ready to learn, because the universe is bigger than just brute force. We may have won today, but tomorrow is always uncertain." The connection cut off, leaving Krenos to stare at the void. The once proud Solarvox fleet retreating into the far reaches of space. It wasn't the victory he had imagined, but it was a victory nonetheless, a victory not won by strength, but by wit, by strategy, and by an unyielding belief that there was more to war than simply defeating your enemy. It was about understanding the enemy, understanding yourself, and knowing when to fight and when to adapt. On the human ship, Captain Lyra watched the screen fade to black, then turned to her crew. The battle had been won, but this was only the beginning. The Solarvox had learned a valuable lesson, but humanity had learned just as much. They had discovered that even the most seemingly invincible empire could be humbled. They had also learned that peace was not something to be won through domination, but through knowledge, understanding, and the willingness to change. The Solarvox would return someday, of that Lyra was certain. But next time, the humans would be ready. And this time, it would be their turn to teach the Solarvox something new.